is somewhat related to some of the comments that Aaron Motsoaledi made just in terms of those engagements with the U.S. government, because our President Cyril Ramaphosa is set to meet U.S. President Donald Trump in Washington next week. It is a high-stakes engagement, and it comes as tensions between Pretoria and Washington hit rock bottom. The presidency says the two leaders will tackle a broad agenda, which include bilateral tensions, regional dynamics, and global cooperation, with a key focus on rebooting a strained strategic partnership. For more on what to expect from this meeting, I'm joined by Newzroom Afrika correspondent Simon Mark. Simon, good morning. Thanks as always for your time. I want to start with something which is around the characterization of this meeting. And everyone remembers the infamous encounter in the Oval Office with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Trump and his deputy Vance. And the idea that, the South African president should be locked and loaded and armed for any eventuality, because we have been talking about countering the disinformation that Donald Trump currently holds about South Africa. And yet, as late as yesterday and the day before, we still hear him say the same thing. His mind hasn't changed. How should our president, what's the sense of how our president should be approaching this meeting?
Hey man, it's great to see you. I think this is going to be the highest stakes bilateral meeting, quite literally, in US-South African history. There's never been a moment where the relationship has been at such a low point, including during the apartheid era. And I think the difficulty for President Ramaphosa, as you correctly identified, is first that President Trump has in his mind these fixed positions that the South African government, of course, argues are based on disinformation. President Trump has repeatedly suggested that Afrikaner farmers are being expropriated of their land without compensation under the terms of the Expropriation Act. And he's also advanced in recent days the argument that Afrikaner farmers are the victims of genocide in South Africa. And clearly, President Ramaphosa needs and wants to push back on that disinformation, but it is clearly also very fixed in the president's mind. And so the scenes that you spoke about that played out when President Volodymyr Zelensky was barracked at the White House, I think essentially mugged at the White House by President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. There is every risk of that happening again with every foreign leader that wanders through the doors of the Oval Office with whom the president has a disagreement. And one of the difficulties that every foreign leader now experiences, and President Ramaphosa will find this out for himself, is that this White House has changed the nature of those traditional photo opportunities in the Oval Office when the two foreign leaders first get together. Under normal circumstances, all previous presidents would allow the cameras to come in for a couple of minutes. You'd get your pictures of the two presidents talking to one another. They'd make cursory remarks of welcome and thanks. They might take a question or two, but then they would want to get on with the closed-door business of the meeting, which is the serious conversation. And so the cameras would all be ejected from the room. That's not the way it works with President Trump. This is the Trump show. For him, the reality television nature of forcing his guests to go through impromptu news conferences that can last, in the case of Volodymyr Zelensky, longer than 55 minutes, but recently in the case of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, the better part of 35 minutes, is hugely challenging because the conversation can go anywhere, and the conversation now gets fueled by the growing number of pro-Trump sympathetic polemicists, not journalists, polemicists that the White House is allowing into the Oval Office as part of the press pool. And they will throw Donald Trump softballs. Some, what the White House refers to as legacy media reporters, suspect that some of these questions are planted, that the president knows they're coming. And that in and of itself can steer the conversation down a very unwelcome path. So it is really difficult to know how President Ramaphosa handles this. I suspect they ought to be studying the way Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, handled it, because he and his delegation had irritation etched on their faces about how long the reality TV show was going on for when he visited the Oval Office a few days ago. But he parried very successfully with these short, succinct answers and sort of refutations of what President Trump had said, but all delivered in the nicest possible way.
I think it's important that context that you draw, because this is not your ordinary statesman to statesman meeting. We have evidence of how these engagements have gone previously. So the preparation that President Ramaphosa and his team would have to embark upon might be, a different form of diplomatic approach, because one of the issues expectedly the president would want to touch on is the characterization that Donald Trump has on the country, which has affected so many other things. And we'll get into one or two of those just now in terms of energy, trade, and whether that can be secured via diplomacy, is that he's got to have all his bases covered.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can tell you what I think is not going to work. President Ramaphosa, just a few days ago, when all of this was being mooted, said that in his telephone conversation with President Trump, he had focused on the fact that, South Africa had been built, the modern South Africa, based on the post-apartheid vision of former President Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo. And he really sought to underscore that a multicultural South Africa based around their vision offered equal opportunity to all peoples, and it was the Madiba Oliver Tambo vision that the country is continuing to advance. I'm not sure that that works with President Donald Trump. I mean, he certainly will have heard of Nelson Mandela. I have to be honest, I'm not sure he would know who Oliver Tambo was or what role he played. And he's much more susceptible to the advice that he's getting from South Africa's critics who have his ear, who say that from their viewpoint, there is a genocide taking place in the country. Land is, they are telling him, being expropriated without compensation. So how you push back on that disinformation in a way that genuinely proves to the president that some of his concerns are misplaced, I think is really complicated. The path, though, is not necessarily to offer, a civics class about the ANC's history and its traditional commitments. As
you say, he's going in, and we've seen this before, with his own set of dogma. This is Donald Trump, which he, it would be surprising if he deviates from. But let's get into perhaps one of the issues. Now, Pretoria said that one of the goals that it has is to reset the relationship, the strategic relationship with the U.S. What would a strategic reset look like in terms of concrete outcomes that South Africa would want to pursue now?
Trade, trade, trade. If we've learnt one thing over the last week from President Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, and today to the United Arab Emirates, it's that this president's foreign policy is absolutely fueled by trade policy. Trade is pretty much the only thing he cares about and the only way in which he judges the quality of his international interlocutors. So you have to go there with some kind of olive branch on trade, whether it is an agreement to find ways of getting Elon Musk's Starlink to operate in South Africa, an issue that obviously sticks in Mr. Musk's craw, but President Trump is also aware of it, whether it is talk of some kind of access to South Africa's minerals, whether it is talk about the possibility of building glorious resorts in the Cape in which American businesses can be involved. And remember that this is a White House that completely conflates the national interest with the personal interests of America's president. His two sons have blazed a trail in the last few weeks in Saudi Arabia, in Dubai, in Qatar, and have struck a whole array of business deals for the Trump organization, the Trump business empire. All of those arrangements that traditionally, the President of the United States would recuse themselves from having any involvement in, Donald Trump is fixated on them. So you have to find a way of persuading him that there is a way of reducing the trade deficit between South Africa and the United States, and there is also a real way of getting American companies to invest at much greater scale in South Africa and to cut the red tape that, for example, has prevented Starlink, Elon Musk's internet firm, from securing licenses in South Africa, because Elon Musk is not currently engaging in opportunities to meet South Africa's requirement for black-owned business. It's all going to be about trade.
So let's pivot from the bilateral concerns, Simon, to how South Africa's stance on Israel, on Iran, and some of the broader geopolitical issues like the genocide case at the ICJ is likely to shape this meeting, especially as we host and maintain our leadership within the G20. And news we're sharing with our viewers this morning is, according to the Washington Post, that the Trump administration has reportedly ordered U.S. agencies and departments to suspend work with the G20 that's set to kick off in November. There's another bigger picture at play here.
Yeah, I mean, we should underscore that decision to suspend work on G20 preparations is a huge deal. I mean, first of all, the G20 Leaders Summit in Johannesburg in November is one of the tent-post events on the annual calendar, and President Trump is supposed to be there because he's got to accept the presidency of the G20 from President Ramaphosa because the United States is hosting the G20 next year. So extraordinary that this work has come to a grinding halt, and the White House certainly isn't disavowing that report by the Washington Post and pointed reporters yesterday to President Trump's earlier comments on he's not sure he can attend the G20 Leaders Summit unless steps are taken to combat what he called genocide in South Africa. So that in and of itself is extraordinary. How you engage with this president and find a way of persuading him that diplomatic ties essentially now need to be warmed, they need to be burnished, they need to be developed, because, of course, he's got to come to G20 in November at a time when the administration is showing every indication of sort of preparing for a withdrawal from G20. We've already seen Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent failing to show up for preparatory meetings ahead of the G20 Leaders Summit. I mean, that's going to be very, very difficult. And on the issue of Israel, I mean, President Ramaphosa has a bit of an opportunity there, because it is pretty clear that Donald Trump's relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu is not what it was. The fact that he didn't travel to Israel this week is a snub of Netanyahu, and Donald Trump's own special envoy, Steve Witkoff, told families of Hamas hostages in Gaza, Hamas-held Israeli and American hostages in Gaza, just over the weekend, that the Trump administration no longer believes that Israel is seeking peace in Gaza, but believes that Prime Minister Netanyahu is seeking to prolong the conflict there. And that's becoming a major issue for President Trump. Now, President Trump's nowhere close to accusing Prime Minister Netanyahu of genocide and is angry with South Africa over that ICJ action. But the fact that that tie between President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu is definitely fraying at a time when President Trump is angering Israel by announcing that he wants to hold face-to-face direct talks with the Iranian leadership, may provide a bit of an opening for some fancy diplomatic footwork by President Ramaphosa, but it still won't be easy because of what happened at the ICJ.
Simon, again, there's so much work one imagines Pretoria has to do for preparing for diplomacy of a different kind, in this almost dystopian context that we find ourselves in. And perhaps in closing then, you know, if you were with the team of the president, you know, inside the presidency this morning in the lead up to that meeting, you know, what kind of other preparation would his team or should his team be considering?
I think it's really got to be focused on concrete deliverables that South Africa can bring to the United States, to its business community, and frankly, to the Trump business organization. I mean, you obviously don't walk into the Oval Office and say, Mr. President, how would you like to build a hotel resort on the top of Table Mountain? But there are ways, of course, of engaging with the Trump organization through different channels that in many ways, I think, become absolutely pivotal for any foreign leader now visiting the United States. I mean, it is absolutely apparent that this conflation of the national interest with the personal and family interests of America's president is baked in. And you only have to look at the way in which the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis have been handling that over the last few weeks and months to understand that there is a pathway that others have laid out. Now, as a country, you have to decide how far down that path are you willing ethically and morally to go in order to secure a restoration of the relationship. But again, the focus is going to have to be on trade and how you reverse the trade deficit and the limitless opportunities that you could argue are available to American businesses in South Africa if, between the two governments, there can be some work done to obviate some of the red tape. But that, of course, gets very difficult in a South African context. You don't have me to tell you that. Because of BEE and the vital needs to spread the wealth in South Africa. I think also an invitation to President Trump, obviously, to travel to South Africa, maybe even before G20, to get a chance to see the country for himself, would not be amiss.
Our Newzroom Afrika correspondent, Simon Marks, thank you very much for talking to us this morning.